everyone. Thank you so much for joining us online for tonight's reading and conversation with Sequoia Nagamatsu and Kim Fu, celebrating How High We Go in the Dark and Lesser Known Monsters of the 21st Century. This event will be moderated by our 2022 Margins Fellow, Katie Yee, and we are so excited to have Sequoia, Kim, and Katie online with us today. My name is Lily Philpott. I'm the Programs Manager at the Asian American Writers Workshop, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you to our virtual event space. A quick visual description of me: I have short black hair, round glasses with black frames. I'm wearing a green jacket over a black shirt and big hoop earrings. This event is taking place across multiple time zones, so please do say hi and let us know in the chat where you are watching from. I'm speaking to you today from Brooklyn, New York, where I am on ancestral and unceded Canarsie and Munsee Lenape land. For those of you who are new to the AAWW, we are a national nonprofit organization dedicated to uplifting Asian and Pacific diasporic literature and storytelling. We hold frequent readings and conversations like this one, organize community arts programming in New York City high schools and senior centers, run fellowship programs for emerging writers of color, and publish an award-winning online literary magazine, The Margins. I want to thank our amazing bookstore partners, Books Are Magic. You can purchase copies of Sequoia and Kim's books via the link my colleague just posted in the chat, and you can support an awesome independent bookstore in doing so. You can find out more by visiting us at aaww.org, or you can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube, where the recording of this event will be posted. During this event, we ask that all audience members practice nonviolence in the chat. Comments that are racist, transphobic, homophobic, ableist, and/or misogynist will be flagged, and the person will be removed from this event. We will open our event with readings from How High We Go in the Dark and Lesser Known Monsters of the 21st Century, followed by conversation, and then we'll have time for audience Q&A at the end of our hour. So please submit your questions via the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. I'll briefly introduce our speakers and then hope you will join me in welcoming Sequoia on screen to read. Sequoia Nagamatsu is a Japanese-American writer and managing editor of Psychopomp magazine, an online quarterly dedicated to innovative prose. Originally from Hawaii and then San Francisco Bay Area, he holds an MFA in creative writing from Southern Illinois University and a BA in anthropology from Grinnell College. His work has appeared in such publications as Conjunctions, The Southern Review, Ziziva, Fairy Tale Review, and Tin House. He is the author of the award-winning short story collection, Where We Go When All We Were Is Gone, and the novel How High We Go in the Dark. He teaches creative writing at St. Olaf College and the Rainier Writing Workshop Low Residency MFA program. He currently lives in Minnesota with his wife, cat, and a robot dog named Calvino. Kim Fu is the author of For Today I Am a Boy, which won the Edmund White Award for Debut Fiction and was a finalist for the Penn Hemingway Award, as well as the New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice. Her second novel, The Lost Girls of Camp Forevermore, was a finalist for the Washington State Book Award and the OLA Evergreen Award. She is the author, most recently, of the short story collection, Lesser Known Monsters of the 21st Century, which she'll read from this evening. Her writing has appeared in Granta, The Atlantic, The New York Times, Hazlitt, and the Times Literary Supplement. She lives in Seattle. And finally, our moderator, Katie Yee, is a writer from Brooklyn and the Bookmarks Associate Editor at Literary Hub. She is currently an Asian American Writers Workshop Margins Fellow, and we are very glad to have her, and a 2021 Center for Fiction Emerging Writer Fellow. Her writing has appeared or is forthcoming in the Los Angeles Review of Books, The Believer, No Tokens, and elsewhere. Again, thank you all so much for being here. I'm going to bring Sequoia on screen to read, followed by Kim, and then we'll have a conversation. Thank you all.
Thank you for having me. I'm Sequoia Nagamatsu. I have short dark hair, rectangular glasses, a short beard, and a blue checkered shirt. I will be reading a chapter from How High We Go in the Dark called Pig Son. After my ex-wife mailed half of my son's ashes to me in an urn, I committed myself to growing the hearts and other organs that might have saved him inside of pigs. It's Fitch's birthday today, which means Dory texts me more than usual, which is pretty much never. Do you remember how I told you that he liked falling asleep, hugging his new collection of comic books? I've forgotten what he smelled like. I never respond to these messages. Dory doesn't really want a conversation. She still blames me for not being there in the end. She's never understood how hard I fought trying to save him. A real conversation would be too painful. It's the same reason I've never addressed Fitch's failed transplant in my peer-reviewed articles. His file sits inside my desk rather than among the lab's program records like a lost statistic. My graduate assistant Patrice is shouting through the intercom, telling me to come to the lab quickly. I hear another voice I don't recognize, muffled and nasal and a little bit frantic, repeating the word doctor as if it's trying to convey an entire thought with a single word. I pull on my face mask and lab coat, open the outer door of my office. My staff is gathered around one of the glass holding pens where we keep our organ donor pigs. The pigs are all destined to help infected people like my son, whose organs have given way to the plague. The timing is crucial, though. We need to reach the infected before they slip into the comas that mark the advanced stages of the illness. This one, Donor 28, was nicknamed Notorious PIG after an intern put a gold chain and shades on him during a Halloween party. The pig studies me as I approach, wiggling its behind, and barely opens its mouth. Doctor. The sound seems disembodied, like a ventriloquist is throwing their voice. Okay, very funny, I say, turning to my staff. Who said that? They look at each other, and Patrice points back to the pen. We think it's notorious, she says. Okay, sure. Forget that these pigs lack the necessary vocal cords for human speech, even if we have genetically modified them for accelerated growth and organ donor optimization. Doctor, this time the pig's mouth doesn't move at all. I'm starting to get annoyed, but there's something about the voice. Again, I say. I hop into the pen, nearly sliding on a piece of shit, and kneel, looking into the animal's blue eyes. Say it. Doctor, he says. Jesus. The pig's strange voice, like a mouth filled with cotton balls, reverberates in my mind. After several more tests, there is no mistaking it. The pig's brain, not quite human and not quite swine, lights up like a firecracker on the MRI whenever he speaks. This does not leave the building. Not yet, I say. We need to know what we have here, and we don't want someone else taking him away. The staff simply nods, but that isn't good enough for me. I need to hear you say it. Yes, I won't say a word. Yes, I won't say a word, they repeat in unison, like we're in grade school. Okay, good. But this isn't some top secret facility. There are no security clearances or repercussions here. The grad students were suspect even before the outbreak, swiping medical supplies for God knows what. I worry it's only a matter of time. We divide the days between working with Snortorius and fulfilling our hospital organ orders. I pay Patrice's sister Ami, a speech therapist, to assist us in our research. We clear out one of the lab rooms to create a study play area for Snortorius. We set up a television and a computer equipped with programmed paddle buttons, specifically modified for pig feet. I dig through my attic for my son's old books and toys. Doctor. It's no surprise the word he heard the most around the lab would be his first. When Ami and I work with him in his room, we break lab protocol and remove our masks and gloves. He seems to soak up everything we share with him: flashcards, cartoons, children's books, including The Three Little Pigs and Charlotte's Web. We treat him like a child, though it's hard to say where his mind is at any given moment. Ami gives him treats, gold stars. Positive reinforcement is important, she says. He's learning so fast. At first, he has a new favorite word each day: sheep, horse, farmer, bus, yellow, mud, Ami. Mornings and evenings, he screams the word hungry or makes a specific request from his rapidly growing vocabulary. Apple, he says one morning, please. The other day, he told Patrice thank you after he finished eating. Good pig. He favors reruns of the old Crocodile Hunter show on Animal Planet, snorting excitedly whenever he sees a hippo. He also has a fascination with rocket launches, the test flights for a manned mission to Mars that somehow always seem a decade away. He counts down with mission control before running excitedly around the room at liftoff. We try to change the station whenever anything disturbing comes on. Neglected and starving farm animals whose owners have died, rotting crops, the displaced clambering onto relief cruise ships after wildfires drove them from their homes. But he's seen the reports of hospital plague wards overflowing into trailers and parking lots and airport hangars. Sick people, doctor, help. He's seen the funerary industry take over our banking system, the footage of people paying for food at the grocery store with mortuary cryptocurrencies tied to ad ridden phone apps. Come laugh with us at the City of Laughter, Snortorius repeats like a mantra until he can form the words. Come laugh with us at the City of Laughter. For only 1,000 bereavement crypto tokens, you can scatter your loved one's ashes on a 1 hour cruise around San Francisco Bay. And then tonight, as I'm about to leave the lab, I hear Snortorius say a new word lonely. I approach his playroom and sit with him, scratching his behind his ears. Lonely pig, he says. My phone buzzes. It's my ex again. A photo of Fitch holding a giant stuffed tiger on his final day. Snotorius repeats himself, and I feel guilty for having given him this life, one that would have ended weeks ago had he remained silent. A heart to Indiana, a liver to Michigan, lungs to Washington, D.C. Of course, we've made other arrangements, sent other pigs, but something tugs at me as he speaks. I think about how when I go home, I'll heat up a microwave dinner, curl up in bed, watch one of the few videos I have of Fitch, a 2 minute clip of him building a sandcastle, over and over until I fall asleep. Instead, I grab the sleeping bag I keep in my office for when I'm burning the midnight oil and decide to keep Snortorius company. He rests his chin on my shoulder as I reach to him. His snorts create a tiny, slimy pool and a wrinkle of my lab coat. We read Where the Wild Things Are. He points a foot when he wants me to linger on a picture, sometimes bringing his snout to the page as if he might inhale the words. Max, he says, wild rumpus. That's right, I say. He can't quite read yet, but Patrice and Ami and I are working with him. He's got his ABCs down, and I linger over each word so he can put two and two together. We finish and switch to the Velveteen Rabbit. I try to flip past the title page, and Stentorius sticks his foot on my hand, points to the orange Stegosaurus nameplate pasted in the front cover with my son's name scrawled in black crayon. Fitch, I say. I take out my phone and show him a few photos. I point to myself and then back to the pictures to drive home the relationship. My son. I don't know if Snortorius can comprehend what I'm saying, though. He was raised in this building since he was a piglet. Fitch, he says. Fitch, son. I recall how Fitch used to yell to me from across the hall after he brushed his teeth, telling me it was story time. He always asked for one more fairy tale, a few more pages, always falling asleep as soon as I gave him what he wanted. Snortorius is growing sleepy too. His eyes are fluttering. At home, on my nightstand, story time has been waiting for years. There's a bookmark a few chapters shy away from the end of The Return of the King, right as they're approaching Mount Doom. Fitch had been trying to read it on his own, despite the book being too advanced for him. But when he was admitted to the plague ward, he'd asked if we could finish it together, our words drowning out the sounds of the hospital. I put away the books and drape a blanket over Snortorius, lie down beside him, dwarfed by his body that's never seen an open field or another barnyard animal. I wonder if he dreams of that life, or if he dreams about the kind of life we once took for granted until the plague threatened to take it away. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sequoia. That section is incredible. I'm going to bring Kim on screen now. Just give me one moment, and Kim will read from Lesser Known Monsters of the 21st Century. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily. And yeah, that was one of my favorite sections from Sequoia's book, so I'm really glad I got to hear him read it. Yeah, I will be reading a story from my collection called 20 Hours that is about a body printer, which is a machine that prints a duplicate of your body at the moment of death that you can re-upload your mind to, and the consequences of owning this machine for a particular married couple. After I killed my wife, I had 20 hours before her new body finished printing downstairs. I thought about how to spend the time. I could clean the house as a show of contrition, and when she returned to find me sitting at the shining kitchen island, knickknacks in place on dusted shelves, a pot of soup on the stove, we might not even need to discuss it. I could buy flowers. I could watch the printing, which still fascinated me, the weaving and webbing of each layer of tissue, the cross-sectional view of her internal workings like the ring sections of a tree trunk. I had poisoned her, a great wallop of poison in her morning coffee. So I didn't have the defense of passion, a momentary loss of reason. Poison took forethought. Poison said, I wanted to be apart from you for a while. Then why not just leave the house? Why not go for a walk? No, it said more than that. Poison said, I wanted you to not exist for a while. I wanted to move through the world without you in it. There'd been no choking, gasping, flailing, spewing. Connie simply keeled over at the table. The soft thunk of her weighty head, the clatter of her empty cup tipping off the saucer, spilling its dregs. Painless, I hoped, though I would have to take her word for it later, either way. A large dose for a small woman. When she's been driving our car, I'll find the seat raised and pushed as far forward as it goes, so she can reach the pedals and see over the steering wheel. I wrapped her briskly in a sheet, put her out on the porch, and filled out the online form for same-day pickup. Connie has killed me only once. We'd spent a week car camping in a state park 4 hours away, in that last week of the season where the frozen ground sucks heat out through the layers of your tent floor, sleeping pad, and sleeping bag, keeping most people away. She'd done most of the packing, loading the hatchback so full I couldn't see out the back window as I drove. And then one morning, as we packed our day bags for a 20-mile loop, she informed me that she'd borrowed our neighbor Jim's rifle. She'd told him she was afraid of bears. We called Jim an old coot in private with affection. She slung the rifle over her back and wore it as we set off down the path. I was glad, in a way. I'd been curious about the experience, but whenever I tried to do it myself, I chickened out at the last minute. She walked in front wherever the path narrowed, leaving me to stare at the long wooden barrel cutting diagonally across her upper back, below her short ponytail. She eventually led me off path into the woods, and there was something vaguely erotic about it, a tugging. The memory of being a teenager, a girl pulling me by the hand from a bush party, away from the bonfire and into the sultry dark, to become invisible bodies among the trees. And oh, how Connie looked when she turned to face me as she shouldered the rifle, how she did not hesitate. Her mouth upturned, her eyes not hard, just clear, certain, confident. Her cheeks flushed from the cold and the exertion of the hike. One shot, extremely close range, to the face. I had the sensation of being blown backward. I would later conflate the memory with a chewing gum commercial I'd seen as a kid, where a man gets blown out of his shoes by flavor, rocketed out of frame, his empty brown loafers left behind. I was shot out the back of myself like a cannon. Her beloved face, explosive noise, nothingness. I thought later that if she'd shot me through the heart or the lungs, or even if she'd beheaded me with an axe, there would have been an in-between, a liminal moment where my eyes were still connected to my brain, still sending signals. Time to look at my ruined body, to see her reaction, see us both splattered with gore. My death felt clean to me, precise, surgical, even though I knew, in reality, it had to have been anything but. Like she knew the pinprick-sized location, above the stem of my spine, behind the cupid's bow of my upper lip, in the center of my brain, where my soul resided. and took it out with a perfect bullseye shot. That's who she was. When I woke up on the printer tray at home, I felt no more disoriented than I did in a hotel bed. And I'll leave it there. I forgot to give a self-description, and I apologize for that. I have dark hair and glasses, and I'm wearing a black sweater. And I'll pass it back.
Thank you so much for that incredible reading to both of you. I wish we were doing this in person so that you could hear all of the applause that would no doubt be resonating from the walls. I'm Katie. I'm very lucky to be one of AAWW's Margins Fellows this year. In terms of an image description, I'm a young woman in my mid-20s. I've got shoulder-length brown hair and bangs, and I'm wearing a polka dot shirt and bright red lipstick. Anyway, so thank you again to both of you for such incredible readings. And I know that you've both been reading one another's works, and I was hoping that we could start off just hearing your reactions to one another's books.
I've been telling everybody about Sequoia's book. You know, the last question, a lot of these kinds of events is, what are you reading? And I love that I get to champion this book. So like, in addition, like the prose is super gorgeous. And I think for me, it hit especially hard to be reading it right now. Like I would go through moments where I was like, oh no, is this what next month is going to be like? Because it's a pandemic story. But I also feel like it was such like a great space to explore those feelings for me, you know, to be like looking at the real grief and the real losses we're going through right now from a different angle, you know, to be seeing it, you know, in this like mirror reality a little bit.
And I think for me, like, I think a lot of the things that, you know, Kim said about my book, I think are true for how I felt about this collection. I love the formal innovation of so many of the stories. I think I was hooked from that first story, that sort of like one-sided interview format. And I feel like Kim tried on so many different hats, played with so many different genres and concepts throughout the collection, but ultimately was using these fantastical devices or science fictional or technological devices to comment on the human condition, to comment on relationships, to comment on our 21st century realities. And that's what I love about speculative or fabulous work, however you want to categorize it. And I'm really interested in hearing about how Kim decided to use these concepts. What was the source of inspiration for all of these disparate ideas?
Sequoia, that is a perfect segue into what was actually my first question, so I appreciate that. I bet a lot of writers in the room are probably wondering, like, what your inspiration for these very singular works has been, whether that's like a person or an emotion or like a science article that you read, you know, like what was the first puzzle piece? And also what was the last? Like, how did you know when you were done?
You got to point to one of us, I think.
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Kim, why don't you please start?
Yeah, I mean, so every one of these stories has its own little origin story behind it. The one I just read actually began with another short story by Elizabeth McCracken called The Goings On of the World. And that story is actually about someone who serves a 50-year prison term, and then he comes out and the world is so changed. But there was just one sentence in that story that went, one morning in the last week of May, I got up, got dressed, and killed my wife. And I was just like, what an incredible sentence, you know, like that. I wanted to take it as a prompt. You know, I took that sentence and I wrote it down and I said, what would my second sentence be? Where would I go from here? And, you know, and I arrived eventually at this fantastical technology and a couple that, you know, murders each other because they can, and they can print new versions of themselves. But the very first stories that were written in the collection, I started back in December of 2017. And I was thinking a lot about like, what was I reading at that time? The first stories I wrote were Liddy First to Fly, which is about a girl who grows wings out of her legs. And then I was writing simultaneously a story called In This Fantasy that begins with a character like imagining themselves as a 19th century landlady. And then I was like, okay, what was I reading right before that happened? And the last book I read before I started working on this collection was Stories of Your Life and Others by Ted Chiang. And then that past summer, I had been reading a whole bunch of Sarah Waters' historical lesbian romances, which is where I think that 19th century landlady thing came from. So yeah, I think that was like those were the first pieces.
So for me, I think the origins of the novel, the very early seeds began when I moved to Japan, and this was kind of on the heels of grieving for my grandfather, who had lost in the mid 2000s. But I think as far as an image, I'd been started researching alternative funerary practices in Japan just because I was kind of dealing with this grief, and I was very fascinated by how the Japanese government and Japanese societies were coming up with incredibly innovative ways to say goodbye when you're thinking about space issues and cost issues in a city like Tokyo. Um, but the image was I was in Ueno Park in Tokyo, and I saw a very large crowd of homeless men that were kind of waiting for food. And I saw several of these men, um, you know, amble into an internet cafe and climbed into these cubicles. And that led me to a documentary where I discovered the social phenomenon of a lot of young Japanese homeless men living in internet cafes. And they were able to use their address, they're able to shower, they're able to use the vending machines for food. And a lot of them were, of course, hoping to escape this kind of sort of stasis existence, but didn't want to return home or didn't want to reach out for to family members even if they had them, because they were ashamed. And I ultimately ended up staying in one of these internet cubicles for a few days because I was just fascinated, and I ended up striking up conversations in very, very broken Japanese, and forging some friendships with these men. And that led to one of the first chapters of the novel, called Melancholy Nights in a Tokyo Virtual Cafe. The very early seeds was a cyber cafe, but of course now we're in the 21st century. So I kind of, I elevated the technology a little bit. Um, I think as far as reading, since I think Kim was looking at reading material, I had come to Japan with one book. I wasn't really planning ahead. And that book was The Dead Fish Museum by Charles D'Ambrosio. And I probably read that story collection 2 or 3 times on that 10-hour flight to Tokyo. And I think I really immersed myself in his story style and his really careful attention to loss and grief and family relationships. And I think that really stayed with me that year when I was writing this story. But I was also reading a lot of Yoko Ogawa, and a lot of Murakami, during that time. And I think, some of those elements, those surreal elements, the dreamlike quality of both of those writers seeped into those first chapters.
Totally. That definitely comes across. Sequoia, you are like my hero in terms of segues, because the next thing that I was going to ask about um, is sort of like this relationship between technology and humanity. I feel like both of these books could definitely be described as like science fiction or fantasy or magical realism, what have you, whatever descriptors you'd like to use, because they both occupy this surreal but quite recognizable world. Personally, I feel like sometimes technology in literature functions almost the way that like magic used to before like 21st century technology was such a thing. But I was wondering if you could both speak to what writing about technology allows you to access about being human. And Sequoia, I'm going to let you start.
Yeah, I mean, I think for a writer not to write about technology or to sort of ignore the reality that we live in is to kind of just ignore our condition right now. We are living in the future in many ways. Just in terms of how social media has changed human behavior over the last few years, I think is quite striking. So I think for me, writing speculative fiction, writing or incorporating technology is essentially my attempt to capture our current condition. But when I am reaching further and writing about technology that we don't have, or something that is maybe a little fantastical in nature, it's a way for me to pluck my characters out of their everyday world, pluck my readers out of our everyday world so that we may better understand our current predicament, you know. And I think as a writer, I'm deeply interested in sort of liminal in between spaces. And we're currently all living in one in the pandemic. We've all been plucked outside of our normal lives. And I think maybe that's one reason why I think maybe during this time, speculative fiction, science fiction, fantasy, horror, whatever it may be, are poised to be the perfect kinds of literature to comment on our chaos and to comment on how we might emerge outside of the end of COVID-19.
Definitely, definitely. And Kim, I would also love to hear your thoughts. I'm thinking particularly about this one short story in your collection, the Time Cubes one. And for those who have not had the pleasure of reading Kim's collection, this kind of centers around a toy maker who their toys kind of have the ability to manipulate time.
Yeah, I mean, I think like I agree with a lot of what Sequoia said about, you know, the necessity of utilizing technology and commenting on what it has done to our brains. And I also think that with imagined technologies, you can paradoxically get closer to the truth of how these things feel than you can through just like literal descriptions, I feel, of the technologies in question. Like I think you can get closer to like the heart of the philosophical core you want to explore that way. Yeah, like, and time cubes as an example, I think is like was for me a way of exploring suicidal ideation a little bit and how that feels in a way that I think it made in general, I think these technologies, they can make really amorphous feelings more literal. Like they can make them into something that we can see, something more concrete, like more black and white questions. The story I read from 20 hours, like with the body printer, it's like it turns what I think are very amorphous feelings about, you know, within a marriage of boredom or of like remembering who you were before them or wondering about who you would be without them into this very straightforward black and white question of life or death, right? Because this machine exists that allows them to kill and resurrect each other. The opening story that we mentioned with this simulator that lets you live out your fantasies, right? It reifies this feeling of, I wish I could see someone who died again. You know, I have regrets about our relationship. And it turns that feeling into something very concrete, into, well, what if you could, right? How would that play out? How would that feel? And for me, that's like strangely, that is a way of like getting closer to the truth. And in that same story, I feel like I got to kind of talk about my anxieties around platforms that use user-generated content, you know, like YouTube and Twitter and things like that. And, you know, to what degree are the people who run the platforms responsible and what rules they have in place and the way those rules are contradictory or, you know, just about their own liability and not about like what is best for the world or humanity or their users, in a way that I feel like I could not articulate the same way if I just wrote like an essay about Twitter, you know, like I feel like I could get at a different kind of truth that interests me that way.
Definitely, definitely. And you've both kind of, I think in the past couple of years, we've obviously had to reckon with a lot of the themes that your characters kind of grapple with, grief in particular, how high we go in the dark. There's obviously an Arctic plague that changes everything about the way that we live and die, not unlike the coronavirus. And there's a story in Kim's collection called Do You Remember Candy, in which people have lost the ability to taste. Now I have been reading up on both of you, she said not in a creepy way, but I know that you mentioned in different interviews that you started writing both of these pieces pre-pandemic, and I was wondering how the past couple of years has like affected your relationship to this material. Kim?
So that story about the whole world losing their sense of taste all at once. I wrote it in 2019, and then the book was out on submission in 2020, right as the pandemic hit. And I had a lot of anxiety about that story in particular. Like I worried that it would be offensive or like painful in a different way than I intended it to be. And the story went through edits and revisions, but in truth, I still felt anxious about that until like very recently when I started hearing from readers who actually had lost their sense of taste. And I've only heard from a couple people, and can't say this is how everyone will respond, but the people have heard from have said that they felt like it took their pain really seriously in a way that they hadn't seen before. And so that was enormously comforting to me, and that is what I intend, and that is how I hope people receive that specific story.
Yeah, like Kim, my agent and I were going on submission in the spring of 2020, and I think as a writer, you're always kind of hoping your agent is going to email you or call you and say, "We're ready. Let's take these to the publishers." And it was just, I think, strange and surreal and unfortunate timing that when my agent said that, the COVID-19 hit. And I was very, I think, initially dispirited and anxious that I was worried that no editor would want to read it, that readers would get the wrong idea. That ultimately, even if I was writing a story about reimagining grief and hope and thinking about community, that all they would see is a plague. Um, I think since the book has come out, and I'm seeing reviews from just your average reader that has no connection or any reason to make me feel feel good. They've been It's been heartening. I've gotten messages from people who have had losses during COVID, and have found it to be a difficult but certainly cathartic experience and a lens through which they can articulate their grief and sort of see a light forward as well. I think there when I was revising the book in 2021, I was certainly cognizant of the fact that I wanted to mitigate or diminish any parallels that might have sort of gotten into the book by coincidence, because I wanted to make sure that readers were inhabiting this catastrophe and not our catastrophe, even though there would be obvious parallels that people would be reminded of. And that even in very dark chapters, no matter how difficult things were going for my characters, that I injected hope in every page and for every character. And I hope that each chapter ended in a place where my characters would be able to articulate their next day, the next year, and another kind of life, whether or not they were able to do that in the near future or not. So.
Definitely. I really feel like Lily and I were just talking about this morning. I feel like in a lot of ways, the experience of reading your novel is sort of the way it felt to kind of move through the pandemic. Just in that there was hope in so many of the sections, and then we were met with like another new devastation, and then we were brought back up again. Both of your books are incredibly dark, but I say that with like the utmost admiration. But kind of like you were saying, there are definitely moments of levity and honestly unexpected humor. And I'm so glad that you both read the sections that you did, because this question kind of gets into that. Yeah, there's unexpected comedy in both of these books. Sequoia, in yours, just naming the pig this notorious PIG. I know people in the comments were laughing and responded to that really with joy. And Kim, like even the first line of 20 hours, really, I laughed out loud when I read that, just the beautiful absurdity of it. And on a craft level, I guess I was just wondering how you get your readers to a point where we can be laughing and also crying, but also laughing. And like, how do you know when to let that kind of levity in? Sequoia.
I think ultimately it's a question of thinking about how your characters are navigating the chaos that you've created for them. And in my case, my characters all have very specific jobs, and that's kind of a way of kind of world building and building out this other story. But when a person is grieving, people grieve in different ways, but I'm also thinking about the reading experience as well. And I don't want it to be a roller coaster that's consistently just going down, 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 down. I wanted to create those peaks and valleys so readers have points of rest and are able to digest a difficult moment in a cerebral or humorous way. And so I allow my characters to have small moments where they're able to um, take a recess from the grief and from the world. And whether it's a bit of pop cultural reference, whether it's a joke, or whether it's just a small action. And I think my novel is kind of built around a lot of these small everyday actions of, let's say, two characters listening to a playlist on an old iPod and forming a bond that way. Or one of my characters listening to Starship of all the bands on a fire escape and finding a weird kind of release through that bit of nostalgia because his family kind of forced him to listen to Starship. And that's actually a bit of autobiography. Like Starship was one of the first cassettes that I owned for my Walkman as a child.
I love that. I love knowing that. And Kim, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think it speaks to the way I experience the world a little bit. I think I feel personally the way Sequoia described, like the way his characters experience the world, that you need these moments of levity and absurdity to kind of get through what is in some ways like kind of the unremitting darkness of real life. And I think that it's important from a craft perspective. I think it makes both of them land harder, right? I think those moments of ease and contentment like mean something very different when you have the darkness looming. And I think the darkness feels very differently, or the fight against the darkness feels very different when you remember what you're fighting for. For some reason it brought to mind like the night my father died. Like I remember like we came home from the hospital, like my mother and my sisters and I, and we had milk and cookies, I remember. And like that moment sticks out to me as like such like a strange and very human moment that somehow like makes that whole night, like the story of that night, like more powerful, in like it makes it more real and more specific. And it was like funny sort of, I remember like coming home and being like, and one of us saying, I'm hungry, right? It's like you still have to eat, you still have to be a person. Yeah, I mean, I can't imagine how you would write without that levity coming in. Like with, I don't know how you would write something that was like flatly dark and flatly grim, like from end to end. Like to me, it's like I wouldn't even know how to tell a story like that.
Definitely. Yeah, that makes complete sense. Yeah, all the characters in both of your books have such a beautiful, like, well-rounded sense of humanity. And that kind of brings me to my next question. There is an undercurrent of optimism pulsating through both of these works. And I was wondering what's something that is keeping you hopeful during this time, Sequoia?
Well, I've been teaching, in addition to my novel, involving a plague and sort of being about hope and family and connections. It's also a kind of climate fiction book as well. There's this undercurrent of a climate crisis. And I think one thing that keeps me hopeful, I'm a professor as well, are my students. And I've seen, their passion, I think, shift and evolve over the years, come from class to class, where, and it's sad that they need to articulate their future in these ways, but they see that the climate crisis is something that's going to affect them in very, very real ways, and they are a deeply empathetic generation. And it's not just that they want to address environmental crises, they are wanting to address the social justice, racial, gender, sexuality issues that might be part of those crises. They recognize that the consequences of climate change are going to be inequitable, and that they want to, a lot of them are pursuing careers and are pursuing majors that will set them on a path to be part of these dialogues in the future. So while a lot of our conversations in class can be sometimes depressing because we are in the world that we're in, my students are fighting for a better future, and I think that keeps me very hopeful.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I mean, my answer is very similar, actually. I was thinking actually about, I've judged a few writing contests for teenagers specifically. And that is always, I always feel so much more hopeful after doing that. They write with such verve and energy and resilience about like what they have experienced, and especially now, like how much they've lost. But that they have such clarity of vision for the future, and it does help to keep me hopeful. And I don't want to put this all on them though. Like I think that that's tempting to hope like the youth will save us. But it's more that they remind me of what we all need to be doing, and about sort of the real life choices you make day to day. I feel like it's, we were talking earlier about social media and technology, and I feel like it's very easy to get swept up, I feel like, in the appearance of morality, I guess, in a way that can be very exhausting, I think. And it is like being connected to young people, like real young people, especially when they're getting to write at great length, as opposed to, in so many characters on Twitter. It does make me feel like this is the world that's important. These are real people who like are influencing like my real choices, and what am I going to do today, stepping out in the world, and where I think that without them in my head, everything can get very abstract.
Mhm. That makes sense. And what a beautiful note to kind of put this section to the close on. I could talk to you both all day. I feel like I have 1,000 craft questions just on a selfish note that I'd love to know the answers to, but I think our beautiful viewers have some questions for you. So I'm going to hand it over to Lily.
Thank you so much, Katie. And agreed, I love that note of ending on optimism and about those stories. I have a couple questions that have come in over the chat. If you have more as you're listening to this section, please feel free to send them to me in the chat or in the Q&A box. The first one is for both Kim and Sequoia. How did you decide what stories to keep in your collection/novel? What was your thinking behind how and in what order you arranged the stories? And actually, Kim, because yours is a short story collection, can I ask you to go first?
Yeah, sure. So I wrote all of these stories between, I wrote all but one of these stories between December of 2017 and the beginning of 2020. And so in writing them all together, I figured they would be, it helped a lot with them being like thematically consistent and of a piece, and feeling like they were a book to me. I feel like it would have been much, much harder if I had been going back through my files, and finding stories I'd written in different points in my career, whether or not I still like them. I just feel like they would have necessarily been written by a different writer, the writer that I was then, and the themes that interested me then, and the influences I had then. And then I actually wrote one more story in 2021 that replaced one of the stories that had been in the original collection, that I felt was sort of retreading the same ground, like that didn't feel, it felt like the other stories covered what that story wanted to say better. So that one I pulled out. I had from the beginning a sense that certain stories would be near the beginning, and some near the middle, and some near the end. That stayed more or less true. Do you remember Candy was always the ending? Like the final image of that story always felt to me like the ending of the book. But the actual literal order, like this story, changed a lot in final revision with my editor, Maisie Cochran at Tin House. She more or less came up with the precise final order that she saw a lot of resonances between the stories that I had not. She saw like ways to showcase the stories in the way I hadn't thought of, like where you might want to group together stories that were thematically similar and where you'd want to set them apart. And that was like an incredible conversation. And I owe a lot to her for that.
I love to shout out our editors as well. That's always so important. And Sequoia, I'm interested in hearing the linked stories and How High We Go in the Dark. That order, did you go back and write others to flesh out portions?
Yeah, and like so I wrote the chapters over a period of about 10 years or so. And of course, it wasn't kind of like I'm coming to my desk and working on How High We Go in the Dark. I kind of procrastinated and published a story collection and did other things in the interim. So that long period definitely led to a kind of kaleidoscopic experience. And the order of the chapters changed a lot over that period. And certainly when I started looking at it as a kind of a novel in stories, the orders started to, I think, change a lot. And I started to think about what stories made sense earlier during the outbreak and which stories could speak to a kind of renewal and community. So a chapter like Grave Friends, I ended up revising to take place, 80 years, generations later in our future, because I have thought that this idea of a shared communal urn would be something that could be the result of a tragedy that happened generations ago. This ripple of grief, really sort of reshaped ideas of death and how we say goodbye. Um, the first chapter was written fairly late in the game, because I realized I needed a stronger opening to introduce the virus, that it didn't exist. Um, and the last chapter was something I actually worked on in grad school as a novel idea. And not to give too much away, it's a chapter that basically spans all of human existence, in something like 4,000 words. And and it's inspired by this scientific theory, directed panspermia, the idea that extraterrestrial intelligences seeded our planet in some way. And I always wanted this book to, I think, if that wasn't going to be a novel, I really wanted this chapter to inject a seed of a cosmic scope into the rest of the pages. And I think once I decided that that chapter would be the conclusion, I went back and dropped Easter eggs along the way that would compound to this sort of cosmic revelation, more sort of, um, we're all connected together, but we're also connected to the universe sort of philosophy. And I'm really loving seeing the readers' reaction because I can kind of tell which readers read closely and which readers were like, what's going on with that ending? And I think there's different ways of reading the book, which I think is another, I think, wonderful thing that, and at the end of the day, you can read a chapter by itself and have some level of fulfillment, and you can take a look at the arc, and have some level of fulfillment. But there are also these hidden layers there if you want a more difficult read. And I was trying to be cognizant of that as I was planting these clues along the way.
I love that. That's so interesting. I feel like I, as a reader, am always reading looking for aliens, and I'll do pay off in the end. So
well, I'm doing that in my life. Yeah.
We have another question. I like this as a sort of follow-up almost to this question about ordering the stories and the collection, from audience member named Albert saying, for Kim and Sequoia, how long do you let your work sit after finishing before you start the revision process? And Kim, would you start us off again?
It depends a lot. It depends a lot on the individual piece, I think. But I do think you need a cool off period. I think I have this roller coaster of emotional cycle with all of my work, where I think there's moments where you think like, this is a work of utter genius, it's the best thing I've ever written, and there's moments where like, this is complete garbage, just throw it away and never look at it again. And it's the same text on the page, like it hasn't done anything, it hasn't changed between those two feelings. And I do think you need space to get away from that first flush feeling, to be able to see it more objectively, to see it with more of an editorial eye. I think also working as a teacher or an editor, like to practice that editorial eye on other people's work, helps a lot with that. I mean, yeah, I feel like there's no like one number that's like perfect for me for any piece of writing. I think it would have, it's like at least 2 days, but I think sometimes it like needs to be years, like it depends on how long you need to exit that story and be able to see it objectively, try to see it as a reader might.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree with a lot of that. And I often tell my students that, along with their revisions at the end of the semester, I have them write a revision statement of everything that they're unhappy with, because I'm upfront. Writing in a workshop or writing within a semester is very unnatural. It's placing these unnatural constraints on the writing process. as a writer, when I think of an idea of a concept or of a character that I would want to explore, I incubate that for a long time. So I have a file on my computer when I think of something that could be a story or it could be a book. It sits there for months, sometimes even longer than that. And sometimes what I think isn't quite a story will hop from one file to another file. It's like, oh, that place and that character actually could be the same thing. Um, and I sort of treat revision in the same way. I'm like, Kim, like I need that incubation period for me to sort of subconsciously work on a problem, or realize that the problems actually exist on the page, and allow myself to, see through my own bullshit and say, this maybe isn't as great as I once thought. And maybe I need to start over. Maybe this story should actually end here. And sometimes, because I'm a writer that is deeply fascinated in speculative conceits, that maybe this needs to be a realist story instead of actually playing with this sort of fantastical idea.
That's so fascinating. Thank you both. I love hearing about the space and time that you need to give your work. I know we have a few questions left and not that much time, but I do want to ask, this is kind of a big question, but I do want to ask it because it's from Katie, and it feels like a very perfect question for the Asian American Writers Workshop. But Katie wanted to know, how do you go about world building? And if you're comfortable speaking to the role of race in your world building, how do you envision kind of casting Asian American identity or Asian diasporic identity into the future? Whether it's 10 years, 100 years, 80 years, Sequoia was saying. Sequoia, could I ask you to start us off there?
Well, at least with this book, well, this is something that I do with my students as well. I try to get all the throat clearing and my geeky fascinations about whatever technology or concept that has started the story seed out of my system before I actually start writing. So I'll do all the research. I'll stare at paintings of planets. I'll look at the NASA website, whatever I need to do, and I'll kind of let that marinate, and I'll let that knowledge become a part of my being, so that when I start writing, I'm not tempted to information dump. I'm not tempted to go to Wikipedia or look at my notes constantly. It's just part of my knowledge base, and I can think about what would be the organic things for my character to say or for my character to do. Something that also has helped me in this novel is that I've given people jobs, and those jobs are a way of hinting at the world state very quickly, while at the same time allowing those characters to go home and focus on those private, intimate moments, those family moments. So it's kind of a way of having my cake and eating it too. Having a character that works at a euthanasia theme park is world building, but I also don't want to focus on that too much. I want to focus on Skip, this character that works there, and how he's forming a bond with a child and his mother.
Thank you.
I agree that you need to do the work off the page. It's like that. It's that simple. You need to have the roles of the world and the technologies you're creating clear for yourself off the page, so that when you are writing, it feels as though a lot is going on beyond the bounds of the story, as though this is just one story happening in this full universe that you have, that makes sense and feels rich and full. Even as I think when you're writing the story, you're focused on just very literally what is in front of the character, like what the world that they are specifically moving through, what they are seeing in their day, only the parts that they would be thinking about, and the rest doesn't have a role in the story. The question about Asian American identity in the future, like I think it's incredible that we are having this conversation, that it's me and Sequoia here in conversation at the event for these books. Like I have felt at different points in my career, not from any one person exactly, but just in general, like this idea that what is wanted from me is to write like a multi-generational family epic about my grandparents suffering. And like there's nothing wrong with books like that. But to me, it's like the future I'm hoping for is where there is this kind of multiplicity of possibility and of different voices and different genres, and that I'm so excited to be here, like that our two books are very much not that, like they're very much something else, and like that we get to be here and in conversation with each other.
Mhm. Yeah, I love that, Kim. I think one of the things that I told Annie Huang, my agent, is that I didn't want this to be pitched or marketed as an Asian novel, right? And it was very important for me, maybe especially because of the rise of anti-Asian sentiments during COVID, that my characters didn't draw attention to themselves because of their Asianness, that they were simply allowed to exist and be. And for a long time when I was reading literature and watching films and TV, I didn't see my identity replicated. I saw sometimes the immigrant experience. I saw World War II, and those were stories of my great grandmother and my grandparents. They weren't my stories. And it really wasn't until I encountered work from writers like David Mura, where I saw writers actually tackling issues of what it means to be a third, fourth generation Asian American, and that particular experience. And that's something that I'm keenly interested in exploring in the future in my own work.
That's so beautiful. I'm feeling just so, grateful for the two of you, for your work, for Zoom, even just bringing us all together. I know we're not all on the East Coast, so if this was in person, as someone mentioned in the chat, this just wouldn't be possible. That's so excited to have you both here. And I know we are at the end of our hour. I do want to end with a question that's kind of related to this. That we are ending all of our events, our AAWW events, which is just the sort of practice of, I'm calling it calling absent friends into our space. And practically what that means is we would love some book recommendations. I want to hear other Asian American authors across any genre, anything, or Asian diasporic writers who you are reading and want our audience to read as well. Any names?
Yeah, there are three Asian American, Asian Canadian poets on my nightstand right now, so it's like easy to point to that because they're right next to me. Paul Tran's new book, and Jen Suk-Fong Lee's new poetry book, and Nancy Lee's new poetry book are three poets that I'm excited about right now.
Amazing. Thank you.
I really loved James Han Matson's Reprieve, which is a wonderful mashup of literary horror. It takes place partly in a full contact haunted house, and it really it explores issues of masculinity, queer identity, racism, and it follows this cast of characters that are in always some ways complicit in the murder of somebody. I'm also really excited to dive into Ghost Forests, which I've heard a lot of good things, and it's it's going to give you a brief blurb. How do you grieve if your family doesn't talk about feelings? I write a lot about grief, and this just seems right up my wheelhouse. And I'm also reading with my MFA students right now. It's just kind of on my mind. No Gods, No Monsters by Cadwell Turnbull. It involves werewolves, and again, it kind of looks at sort of issues of race and sexuality with werewolves. So a plus.
Amazing. I want to do a very quick AAWW pitch. Pik Xuan Feng, who wrote Ghost Forest, is actually a former Margins Fellow. And we did her book launch for Ghost Forest. She talked with King and Chang. They were brilliant. We did a cooking demonstration afterwards with Chef Eric Wong, who made like poached garlic chicken. It's all on our YouTube channel if you want to check it out. This event will also be on our YouTube channel. I do want to close it up, let people step away from their computers this evening and kind of take these words in this conversation with them. Before we do so, I just want to give huge thanks to Kim and Sequoia and Katie. Thank you so much for guiding our conversation. Thank you, Kim and Sequoia, for these books and your wisdom. I want to thank Pro Bono ASL, as always, who are absolutely amazing. And I want to thank Jenna in particular, who's on screen right now, and Jean, who was on screen earlier. Thank you both so much. We are doing a number of virtual events, a couple of in-person events in the New York City area, but please do join us, and I hope we can gather everyone at the workshop someday soon, maybe next year. But thank you all so much. Have a wonderful evening, and we will see you soon.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you.
Thank you. Take care.